All right, so thanks for everybody coming. I know this is one of the first sessions of the day. My name is Nick Smolofsky. I'm actually at the Bad Elf booth, booth 29. I decided instead of doing a vendor presentation that I thought we could talk about maps because, you know, honestly, let's not talk about GPS anymore. That's old news, right? And if you want to talk about Bad Elf, again, booth 29. So my background, usually I'll self-introduce myself because my last name is long and confusing and no one can pronounce Smolofsky. So I've got a PhD in behavioral geography, so I studied what people's perceptions of safety and trust in urban environments, how that impacts their spatial activities. And so basically how our perceptions of our urban environments basically predict our behavioral patterns. I've got a master's in GIS and a bachelor's in history and anthropology. I also teach at ASU, so I kind of wear two hats. I have the GPS hat, and then I've got the teacher hat. I don't know which one I'm wearing today. I've got the man bun on. That's what we got. So usually I have this thing called an agenda, but we're going to throw that, you know, it usually keeps me on task, but we're going to throw that to the birds today because that's no fun either. And so we're going to take an approach kind of like the story arc today. So I'm going to walk you through some things about maps. You probably won't learn anything, but hopefully you can laugh with me or at me at some point during the show here. But we're going to talk about maps and why maps are important and why maps were important to me, why they're important to you. And we're going to end with a challenge and something I call the geospatial moment. And so you can kind of follow this bell curve as we get going. So the plot starts with, well, what is a map, right? And so Wikipedia, everybody uses it. It's a good place to start. You can read here that it says a map is a symbolic depiction emphasizing relationships between elements of some space, such as objects, regions, or themes. Maps can be static, they can be fixed to paper, durable mediums, they can be dynamic and interactive, they can depict geography. As I mentioned earlier, they can also depict human geography, right? So maps have been around a long, long time. In fact, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but if you get into the middle of this paragraph, it starts talking about brain mapping, DNA mapping, cognitive mapping. Mapping is all over the place. So who makes the maps, right? Well, these are what we call cartographers, and most of us here are probably a cartographer at some level, right? So cartography is literally the act of making or the practice of making or using maps. Nowadays we can, you know, it's a lot more robust than that, but cartographers have been around a really long time. This is nothing new. So who makes maps? You all make maps, right? So maps are obviously at least semi-important to you because your jobs are based around them. And maps can be utilitarian, right? I was walking up to the conference hall today and I saw a great map of Winston-Salem downtown. It was telling me how to get around the city, right? Perfect, that's great. And why that's great is literally because our brains are wired to utilize maps. And so there's this gentleman here, his name Edward C. Tolman. Tolman was around in the early 19th century. I believe he was a professor at UC Berkeley. He wrote a very famous paper called Cognitive Maps in Rats and Men. And you may have seen this image before. It's called Tolman's Maze. And so he postulated and determined that basically all biological creatures utilize maps in their brain. We use this spatial activity to basically stay alive. So he was able to prove that rats were able to navigate the maze in different circumstances to continue to get the cheese, and effectively they were able to run the maze over and over again, faster and faster, because they were memorizing the layout. This is for the first time in human history in the early 19th century that we realized there's an innate connection between maps and our human brain. We can't function without it, and I'm a little scared as we move into the digital realms that we aren't really using some of the mapping capabilities of our brain. And what happens when we don't use a muscle? It becomes lame, right? There's also this guy named Howard Gardner. He's alive right now. He's a professor at Harvard. He talks about his theory of multiple intelligences. Notice that one of the intelligences that he picks out right away is this spatial intelligence. And so we all learn different ways. And some of us learn spatially. Maybe you've done some type of, not like necessarily an IQ test, but they have those personality tests and things. They can really basically figure out that ability. And so knowing how people learn can really help, right? Like some people are great at reading a book and they can linguistically learn. Some people need to go out and actually hike around, right? And go and experience the environment. So again, just wanting to make sure everybody understands that we are inherently map makers from birth. We can't get around it. So, because everybody always, learns about maps from, Wikipedia and psychologists, that's a bad joke. I figured that we would just spend a moment.
I am the cat in the hat, and I am happy to say there's a map on my lap.
Have you guys ever seen this?
We will travel the
Map
world,
in my lap. Anybody like Dr. Seuss, right? So I love this book. I keep it on my desk. It's so good. And so I'm just going to be quiet for 2 seconds and let's just listen to how we depict mapping to
When map
kids.
makers make maps, they must first decide who will be using the map and what it needs to do. The map of the Earth that we use most of all is a globe. Like the Earth, it is round as a ball. Peel the skin of an orange and lay it out flat. A flat map of the Earth would look something like that. Now, if maps were the size of the places they show, map makers would run out of paper, and so a chart called a scale makes maps easy to use, shrinking miles into inches on each map that you choose. You can make a map of far places you roam, or a map called a plan of your very own home. We used this scale. 1 inch equals 3 feet. It helped us do something we both think is neat.
FYI, if
We
you don't
drew our
put scale
whole room
bars
so
and
it
north
fits
arrows
on
and
one
keys in
sheet.
your map,
There are 4 main directions.
even
all
Dr.
maps
Seuss
are covered.
recommends it.
North is on top, south down at the bottom. If you look to the right, that is where east will be. Look to the left, and it's west that you see. To remember all 4, here's one easy way. Never eat soggy wheat, is what I always say. I have here an atlas. Come on, take a look. You will find lots of maps, and they're all in this book. Sometimes maps use pictures to show where things are. A capital city is marked with a star. A tent shows a campsite. Tracks show where a train is. To get to the airport, just find where a plane is. Some maps use colors to tell you a lot. I used blue where it's cold and red where it's hot. I made deserts light brown and jungles bright green. The legend will show you what these colors mean. Marine charts help boaters. These maps let them know if a rock, reef, or sandbar is hiding below. When you visit a city where you've never been, a city map helps you to know where to begin.
Okay. I think you get the point, right? Go ahead and moving forward, if you are starting to instigate, some training policy at your company or organization, I don't mind if you go ahead and steal my idea and use this as the intro to your training for your new GIS techs. So how did I get into mapping? How did you get into mapping? Well, honestly, my grandmother got me into The Lord of the Rings when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade. I got the first copy of The Hobbit. I remember that I had actually gotten a big poster, and I had this exact map on my wall. And to this day, I literally turned 40 this year. I'm a geriatric millennial. I have memorized this map. And when I watch the movies even now, or even some of the newer like Amazon shows on Lord of the Rings, I spatially remember this thing. I have the context of where Rohan and Gondor is, right? So maybe as a kid, you got excited with a map like this. Or maybe you played the game of life with your parents or your friends, right? We see this game board, and again, while it's very simplistic, it is a map, right? And depending on what part of country you're in, we had snakes and ladders, but apparently there's a chutes and ladders as well. Snakes seemed a lot cooler than chutes to me. But again, here, even as kids, we're able to start spatially reasoning and making determinations on what to do even in a game because of maps. Or if you were like me, I liked video games. And so in 1986, Zelda came out on the NES. So you can see this was the old cartridge system. You'd have to blow in it, and you'd have to kick your Nintendo to work. But there was literally a Nintendo magazine, I think like Nintendo Power or something. It would come out occasionally, and they had the full Zelda map in it, right? And so maybe you were playing video games as a young kid, and you were utilizing these maps. In high school, this is a fun story quickly. I was in AP English, and we were reading Dante's Inferno, right? So one of the kind of classics that you would read in school. Well, I got in a lot of trouble, and so here I am, young Nick, 17 years old, and instead of taking notes, and the professor or the teacher was Dr. Ryan, and Dr. Ryan said, Nick, what are you doing? You're not paying attention. Pay attention. Stop drawing. I am paying attention. And so I argued. I got sent to the principal's office, and I ended up having to do work hours after school. Long story short, my parents were proud of me, though, because once you looked at what I was doing, I was literally making a map of Dante's Inferno so to help me remember the stages of hell, right? And so, yes, it's a crude map, almost like an infograph, but that was the way I was learning. I didn't even know at the time that I liked maps. It's just, here it is, right? And so for some reason, I kept this map and I still have it today. So, or maybe you watch something like this, right? So everybody in the world today is a Game of Thrones fan. I don't know about y'all, but I love this intro. It's a great map of Westeros. It's flying in. It's doing a lot of incredible things. Your senses are honestly getting exhilarated, right? You could almost feel what this land is like. And yeah, this is like a show, right? We get it. And they have a lot of money. But the reality is the software packages we have today can do this. There are companies out in that room right there that do 3D mapping and modeling and graphics like this all day long. This isn't just some intro video anymore. I mean, this is the reality. If you could convey your map like this to your customer or your end client, just think about what you could do. Just because of time, we're going to keep going. I normally talk way too long. We've got about 15 minutes. Okay, so maps are marvelous things. Who here has seen the book on the left, How to Lie with Maps? Yes, it makes me so happy. So you can go to Amazon, I can never pronounce his name, Mark, I'm just going to leave it as MM. You can go to Amazon, you can get a used copy for like $7, $8. I highly recommend it. You can absolutely lie with maps. Maybe you've heard of lying with stats, right? In the same way, right? We can move the data around to kind of tell a different story. Well, that's absolutely the case with maps. Maps, here's another great book. This one's called Power, Propaganda, and Art, right? And then on the right, I love this. This is obviously an older poster, right? Actually talking about like World War I times. But it was literally trying to convince people to make maps, right? Like, for military purposes, maps are weapons. And so that's kind of an interesting thing, right? Also, not all maps are created equally. I was just looking at propaganda maps online. You Google it, and this is sort of the images that pop up first. When I say not created equally, these people created this map with a very distinct intention, and maybe that intention is awful and racist and prejudiced and sexist, right? People can make really terrible maps. And honestly, the colors, the symbols, the way we depict things on map have meaning. So the next time you're making a map, don't just drop a dot on the map. Think about what you're doing, right? What color, what is that map going to elicit? You know, and it's interesting that you have this kind of symbology or this symbolism of a spider or, an octopus as kind of this evil thing, right? But maps are not created equally. And so we need to be careful because as map makers, we're like magicians. We have this marvelous superpower, as our friend here, Dr. Kursky, likes to say. We have a superpower because we can literally see what others can't with maps. I love this one. This is Muhammad al-Idrisi, right? And so this was around 1100. I think he died in 1165. This map is called Tabula Rogerina. If you pull up a map or you Google search maps, there's a good chance you've seen this map. Has anybody ever seen this map before? Maybe a couple of y'all. So this map was actually made, so I love the story too. He's a Moroccan Muslim working for a Christian king and queen in Sicily, Roger II of Sicily. So interestingly enough, he was, at that time, he was able to break a lot of barriers and do some crazy things. But at the time, this was basically the most detailed map on Earth. I mean, seriously. Maybe you've heard of this gentleman down here, Gerardus Mercator. So we're going to step ahead about 400 years, the 1500s. Maybe you've used a coordinate system called UTM. Does anybody know what the M stands for in UTM? Mercator, right? So he was pretty important. Without Gerardus Mercator, his maps and his ideas of distance and bearings and parallel, like latitudinal lines, we wouldn't have gotten across the ocean. This is how we've navigated for, actually, still today. It's not the fastest way to navigate. It's not like as the crow flies, but it will get you there. So if you've ever used UTM, we've got to give a shout out to Gerardus Mercator in the 15th century. Pretty interesting. His mapping and what he did here is effectively what WGS84 is today. And so if you pull up Google Earth or an Esri story or an Esri map, there's a good chance that this guy had something to do with the way you're seeing that map. I love this one as well. His name is Joseph Menard. He was a Frenchman. Now we're talking Napoleon's time, so 17th century. This is one of the freaking coolest maps I've ever seen. It doesn't do justice, and I could spend literally every last minute I have talking about this map. But I'm a history buff. I love the nerdy stuff. So what you've got going on here, and I think what's important here is maps are starting, you can see this evolution of maps were very utilitarian. This is my village. This is the wall. This is the well. This is where my enemy is. This is where I killed the elephant, whatever, right? It was just like, this is where the trail was. You know, you can even imagine 50,000 years ago, people in caves, you know, in Neanderthal times, they're literally depicting stuff, you know, rock art, and those are maps. But by, you know, the medieval times, we're starting to understand that maps have more functionality and purpose than just laying out places and things spatially. They can depict a story, a narrative. And so what you've got going on here, this is France, this pinkish red, beige, salmon colored thing. This is literally Napoleon's army, okay? So the width here depicts the amount of troops he has. You can, it's hard to read, but it says 422,000 troops. So when Napoleon started his march towards Russia, he had 422,000 troops. And you can literally follow, and as his troops die and go to different places that are depicted, you can even see rivers and some towns as he's marching all the way to Russia into Moscow. And by the time he gets there, he's only got about 100,000 troops. So he's lost 25% of his force because of weather. Now, the next thing is the black line is him retreating and where he went. He returns with 10,000 men. I mean, that should give you goosebumps, right? I hate to bring up geopolitics today, but there happens to be a conflict in Europe right now. And, you know, we need to understand things like this. This is a great way to understand that if you're going to mess with Russia, you better get ready. Every person that's ever tried to mess with Russia, they have to deal with the weather, right? And they inevitably get beat. But this is a really neat way, again, to show something more than just places. And take a look at it if you ever get a chance. Joseph Menard in the 17th century, or I'm sorry, 1812, I guess is when he actually made it. So I was going to talk about another mapper. He's real famous. We're in the Game of Thrones kick. His name's Jon Snow, but it's not this Jon Snow. It's that Jon Snow. So maybe you've heard of this. Anybody heard of Jon Snow before? Yeah, great. So at this point, we are really getting analytical. I mean, we are starting to understand things for maps. And so what Jon Snow did in the 1800s, in London, he mapped cholera. So the map on the left, it's a base map, and all the dark blotches are basically incidents of cholera. What he was able to understand once he plotted all the incidents, he realized there was a correlation with the incidences with the places. Guess where cholera broke out a lot? Near the wells. All the watering systems, that's where the spread of the disease was. Guess where cholera wasn't? The bar, literally the taverns. There was no incidences in taverns. That's proof that God loves us, quoting Benjamin Franklin. Literally, the taverns and bars had lower incident rates than the water because why? To make beer or mead or wine, you're literally treating the water, right? You're taking it to a different stage. This is just a fun little three-dimensional kind of representation of the building and the streets a GIS student had made. But Jon Snow's a big one, right? Because we're literally starting to see things we couldn't have seen before, right? If you were just walking around London at the time and you're like, oh, he's dead. It's like, what was the movie, Bring Out Your Dead? You know, the old, like, he's got the cart and just people are, you know, the old Monty Python, exactly, right? There was no context to it all. So all of a sudden we drop it on a map, boom, the picture explodes. We see what's happening. Now we can make better informed decisions to, you know, mitigate cholera. There's a gentleman I'm going to recommend. His name is Kenneth Field, Dr. Kenneth Field. I love his little title. He's a professional carto nerd. That's a super technical term. Look it up. Dr. Fields is one of the best cartographers I've ever met. I've had the pleasure of meeting. He works for Esri. He wrote this book called The Definitive Guide to Making Maps. Highly recommend taking a look at it. He, at one point, I believe, had the most morbid map on Earth with the most morbid traffic at the time, and it was this. It was called Over the Edge, Death in the Grand Canyon. We just had the quintessential 150th anniversary from when John Wesley Powell went down and mapped the Grand Canyon. We had it at Arizona State University. We did a two-day conference. He came. He printed out a huge map like this. It's actually in 3D. I had it printed and kept in my lab, at the GIS lab there. But effectively, he mapped all the places people have died in the Grand Canyon. And it's a lot. And it's hard to read from where you're at, but it's like death from a fall, death in a helicopter, death climbing, death from snake, death from angry spouse. Like there's all kinds of reasons. And it was like literally, I think, the most viewed map for a while. We're going to talk about another map that I think takes the place in morbidity here in just a moment. But Dr. Kenneth Fields, if you go to an Esri UC, you need a good keynote speaker, absolutely look up Dr. Kenneth Fields. I'm going to switch to a former student of mine. His name's Carl Churchill. He works for the Wall Street Journal. He is a cartographer. In 2020, he made a map of the Tuareg Rebellion, a story map. Look it up. It's absolutely the most stunning map. And at the time, I think it was the most viewed Esri story map. He makes really crazy, awesome maps. And now he does that at Wall Street Journal. I mean, he's literally a graphics reporter. I think that is so neat. And this Tuareg Rebellion, this is in Africa, the Tuaregs, this 4 or 5 different competing tribal country nations and terrorism. And I think he got flagged actually by the State Department because he was doing so much research and collecting live or kind of like news articles from the area in Africa in the conflict zone. Check it out. And I mean, absolutely some of the most stunning maps. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention another gentleman, John Nelson at Esri, is another just wonderful cartographer. I'm running out of time, but obviously I have to mention this. So who here has seen this map? Who here has logged? Everybody's got to raise your hand, right? Everybody's seen this map. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, I was at my house, obviously, and I had a tablet up on the stand, and it literally on my tablet for about 4 months straight, the death clock was just there. This is the most viewed map ever. It's got billions of views. But think about, let's get away from the negative side of COVID. Think about what this did in terms of mapping. Everybody all of a sudden knows about the Johns Hopkins dashboard. All of a sudden, if you needed to talk to your constituents at your company or organization, the government agency you work for, and you're trying to justify some mapping, you can bring up a dashboard and be like, did you ever use this? Do you know how much information this disseminated around the world? How much policy this affected? I mean, this is crazy stuff. And I just think it's like a monumental task. I mean, just think about all the countries. Everybody reported things differently. Think about the aggregating that data. Who here has ever dealt with census data? By the way, isn't that awful? God, I hate census data. And why can't we why didn't the government just prepackage the data correctly? Why do I have to do work to use it? I have a conspiracy theory that I don't think the government actually wants us to see the census data because it's so confusing to use. Nowadays, it's not so bad. Esri posted up on Atlas, but if you're an OG mapper, you'll remember what I'm talking about. But dashboards, right? This is the future. The way we now show data is not so much static maps. I did a poll at Esri UC about 5 years ago, and I asked a bunch of people, do you take paper maps into the field anymore? A lot of people don't even use paper maps. Quite frankly, when's the last time you used a map to drive somewhere? Other than on your phone, right? Google. Interesting, fun story. A couple of years ago, right before COVID, I was at Intergeo. It's a big conference in Germany. My dad flew over and met me. My family's traditionally from Czechoslovakia, south of Prague, and we had a great time. You know what we did? We rented a car. We bought an atlas of Germany and Czechoslovakia, and for 4 days we went off grid, and our whole trip was just, we picked places on the atlas, and we figured out how to get there. We didn't pick up a phone. We didn't ask for directions. We literally, it was a magical experience. And obviously Czechoslovakia is a very cool place. Prague is beautiful, but gosh, like nowadays maps are so much more than that, right? So this gentleman I'm going to throw out there, maybe you've met him or heard of him. His name is Keith Masbeck. Keith Masbeck used to be one of the directors, a former director of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. That's sort of a big deal. Right now, he's actually more of an investor, so he's really into the space sector, remote sensing, SAR, INSAR. He was on a podcast called The Geoholics. You've probably heard me plug this if you've ever been around me. Bad Elf's a supporter of The Geoholics. I'm also a co-host. We have a little over 100,000 listeners now. A new episode pops up every Sunday. We interview people. We interviewed Keith Masbeck, and he said, we are in the geospatial moment, In fact, you can go on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, whatever. Go to episode 124. It's an hour and a half long. Everybody's got to commute home. Listen to this, dude. I'm the really screechy sounding voice don't listen to me. But his insight is just fantastic. And he said we are in a geospatial moment. We are in a geospatial moment. The phones, everything today is connected. Everything is a location-based device, right? Like the tire pressure gauge, like your tire that has where you fill the air, talks to your car, tells your car if you need air, that's attached to your phone with a map. I mean, everything is connected now. I mean, to the point where even video games like Pokemon Go are utilizing like augmented reality and using maps, right? So this geospatial moment, this is the challenge I would have for you. Like, how are you going to embrace it, right? How are you going to use new technologies, maybe GPS or LiDAR or drones or AI, deep learning? Who here has maybe started using stuff like the random forest? You notice if you're an Esri person under the analysis geoprocessing tools, there is an artificial intelligence there called random forest. So you can actually start doing predictive modeling, right? Just think about as we get towards the metaverse. What is that going to do for us, right? I mean, these are real things nowadays. I mean, there's a vendor out there that's got the metaverse. You can go put your gear on, right? So in this geospatial moment, how are you going to leverage it? How are you going to embrace it? How are you going to make the maps of tomorrow? That's basically all I got. You can follow me on LinkedIn, reach out to me. I don't know if you learned anything, but I guess at the end of the day, I just want to, honestly, I just wanted to read maps in my lap. That was the whole reason. But I want to applaud everybody here. Thank you for making maps. Thank you for what you do, right? Like you are helping the earth, you're helping society, you're helping the environment. Mapping is so critical, and I don't think we take a time to recognize what y'all do. And I know sometimes we're like, well, what do you do? I do GIS, and people are like, I don't even know what that means. Well, I think that's changing, honestly. I mean, you can see it now, right? Things like the COVID dashboard, you can see everybody starting to adopt this type of technology. And so again, thank you. Keep making really good maps and stay curious and creative, right? Encourage your kids, encourage your young employees to make maps. I mean, take out a pen and draw a map. Have fun with it. Like, think of your childhood in the neighborhood you grew up on. Draw a cognitive map of that. Have some fun with it. And I bet if you haven't made a map in a while and you can spend 5 minutes and make a map, you will remember why you got in this whole field to begin with, right? And you'll remember why you love maps. So, thanks, everybody. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's really questions. I guess there's 2 minutes. Any questions? Or what's a map y'all like? Is there a map out there maybe I didn't depict that you really like that's been monumental in your life, whether it was a board game or?
I've not seen the Game of Thrones, Dr. Ed. Sorry, I'm probably the only person in this room, but I do love books that you mentioned. Also, I use know the places you'll go in geography books. And to your last point, I have my students at the University of Minnesota draw a map of their own neighborhood and where they grew up. And like you said, it's very detailed. We're all, the whole idea is that we're, like you said, we have this mental map at a very large scale of where we grew up. So I love that idea, and it's been very good to connect with us.
That's awesome. What else? Anybody? Any comments, thoughts? Another minute?
Do you teach academically when you're at the college? Are you this engaged?
Yeah, I have a lot of energy.
You gotta keep them.
They got to slow me down, honestly. No, I'm very energetic. I run around, so it's kind of sometimes hard to do it remotely because I'm like in and out of the camera and the microphone's getting loud. And yeah, I find that if you're energetic, people get engaged, And if you can see my passion, like I have a passion for this, you can then kind of feel the presentation, right? And do that same thing. Maybe you're not doing presentations, but be energetic about your maps. Be excited. Go to your boss and be like, look what I made. Look what I figured out. This is amazing. It's pretty cool, right? All right. Thanks, everybody. Go grab some coffee.